thoughts and opinions expressed in this podcast belong to the speakers and are not reflective of any organization. The content presented here is for general information purposes and should not be construed as advice.
Welcome back to Animal Introspective, the podcast all about animal well-being and the well-being of the people who care for them. We're your hosts. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Grace.
And today we have Dr. Lisa Gunter on as a guest. And Dr. Gunter is an associate professor of animal behavior and welfare at Virginia Tech in the School of Animal Sciences and directs the Center for Applied Animal Behavior and Education. Before beginning her graduate studies, she worked for nearly a decade in animal shelters and with pet dogs and their owners. The goal of Lisa's teaching, research, and extension is to better the lives of people and their pets. Prior to joining Virginia Tech, she was an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Coastal Carolina University and the Maddie's Fund Research Fellow at Arizona State University. Lisa is a certified applied animal behaviorist and earned her PhD and MA degrees in the Behavioral Neuroscience and Comparative Psychology program at Arizona State University in the Canine Science Collaboratory. Hi, Lisa. We are so happy to have you today on our show.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking me to come on. I'm excited.
Thanks. So to get started, we're just curious, what was a moment that sparked your passion in applied companion animal behavior?
Oh, it's a great question. Well, when I look back, my training, my bachelor's degree was in absolutely none of this. So I was a music journalist. I was working at alternative news weeklies, hanging out with bands, writing about music, and I did that in Washington State. I went to Evergreen State College, and when I returned back to the Bay Area, I started volunteering in the animal shelter, and I was really curious. I ended up being pretty curious about behavior because as much as I like spending time with the dogs, going on walks with them was like, it's all right. But what I was really curious about and interested in was training the dogs. And from there, the training, we would also do play groups with the dogs. So I think I got really interested in observing them and trying to understand what they were communicating, and then also try to, help them have a little bit better life when they were there.
I love that. Music studies, dog shelters, they really have so much overlap. It's great.
I participated in this project that was kind of about women in STEM, and folks have asked me about that sort of transition or a comparison between the two. And in my opinion, I think science is it doesn't get enough kudos for being so creative. And being curious about the world, but then constructing these sort of research questions to kind of answer those questions out in the real world. I think that there's a lot of creativity there.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. And so you mentioned training dogs and play groups and animal shelters. So a lot of modern animal shelters have their own behavior programs. So bring us up to speed on exactly what these behavior programs do and how they benefit animal well-being.
Sure. I think that I've been involved in animal sheltering for over 20 years now. And so I've seen a lot of changes that have occurred in sheltering. And I think certainly more in the 2000s, we were seeing a lot of interest in not only behavior assessments, which were kind of also sort of new, but been going on for a while, but trying to modify the behavior of the dogs. And then things maybe like enrichment, while important, weren't quite the focus. And so I think we've seen that change over the past decade and a half, where I think that there's some interest still in modifying behavior, so putting dogs and cats on behavior modification programs and looking for changes in behavior prior to the dogs or cats going up for adoption. And I think there's a little less focus on that and a little bit more interest in supporting them there, and maybe all of the animals, not necessarily just the dogs and cats that are struggling, but trying to support the well-being of all the animals in care with various forms of enrichment, including a lot of what we study, which is human-animal interaction.
Yeah, I feel like that makes so much sense, that looking into every single piece of their stay in a shelter environment and all of the different factors, not just kind of focusing on one, but looking at really everything.
Yeah, and I don't know if like the average person typically knows that about an animal shelter. Like maybe they're familiar with that you go to an animal shelter to adopt your next pet, but they're not quite sure of, again, about like the science of it and the art of it, of managing that group of animals and trying to ensure their well-being and set them up for success.
Yeah, I think that I think there's been kind of more of a realization that not only is the shelter stressful, which I think has been appreciated for a long time, but that it might be hard to change behavior in under those circumstances, and it can be hard to predict, despite even working with the animals, that the changes we make in that environment will carry over to the next. I think some do, maybe, and some don't. And I think some of that is an appreciation that these environments are quite different, and it can be influenced by not only, the actual physical environment, but the people that are in them and the people that are interacting with the animals.
And with this focus in your research on animal welfare in a shelter setting, what are some of the factors that you think contribute the most to decreased welfare?
Sure. I think it's sort of interesting thinking about the life of a dog or cat in the animal shelter. A lot of our work is focused on dogs, or majority of it. And so if we think about their life, even in like a really wonderful shelter, dogs may be spending 20, 21, 22 hours on their own every single day. And then not only is that sort of separation or isolation from people interaction, but then they're surrounded by like 50 of their best friends, but actually might not necessarily be their best friends. So you've got other dogs around them that are going through kind of the same experience and also might be struggling. So that can kind of be hard to be around. They're often singly housed to prevent kind of disease spread. Some shelters, I think, are kind of using co-housing, not necessarily as a way to conserve space and help more dogs, but as a way to improve well-being. But oftentimes they're on their own in this sort of stressful situation. And so I think that I think one thing I've been particularly interested in is like the social isolation piece. Although I think anybody that enters an animal shelter can be quite sensitive to how loud it is, and just the sort of restrictions that are placed on the animals by living in these kennels.
And then, so what do you think from your studies and from looking into this would be some of the biggest, most impactful actions that could help with these issues? Like, what would be the simplest changes?
The simplest changes, get the dogs out of the shelter. I think that's what a lot of our fostering interventions have focused on. While they are a form of human-animal interaction, which even in the shelter has proven to be impactful. So if you can't get them out, at least spend time with them. But I think fostering kind of has like a 1-2 punch when it comes to addressing the limitations of the shelter. And that's one, spending time with people, which we can do in or out of the shelter, but it actually kind of gets them away from all those sort of detriments that they experience in the welfare or in the shelter, whether it's the noise, whether it's the confinement, it's the unpredictability, the lack of routine, all that kind of goes away when they go into a home.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Of course, it seems like the most obvious answer of, let's just prevent animals from getting into the shelter to begin with. And I like that discussion of like the proactive way versus the reactive, or the proactive solutions versus the reactive solutions, right? Are you a strong advocate for first we should be doing our best to decrease the factors that might bring an animal into the shelter to begin with? And what are some of those? I'm curious.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, it is multifactorial when it comes to why dogs and cats end up in the animal shelter. I think certainly behavior plays a role, where they may not necessarily be a match for the home that they're living in. But I think more and more we're beginning to appreciate just how housing and financial concerns can really impact whether or not somebody can keep a pet that they care deeply about. But I think not only is it typically more expensive to live with your pet, you may have to pay a pet rent, a pet fee to move in, but then there's just simply not a lot of housing that allows there's less housing that allows for pets. And then when we're talking about those dogs that are a bit bigger or maybe a breed that has some negative breed stereotypes, it can be very challenging, if not impossible, to try to find housing for your pets. So I think yeah, and then there's also just, I think, other concerns or other things that come up, just personal hardships that have really nothing to do with the pet, but can impact whether or not a person can keep them.
Yeah, and I really appreciate kind of that very empathetic approach to the reasons why a dog or a cat or any animal might end up in a shelter, because sometimes like in mass media, we may find more of like a negative association around surrendering an animal to the shelter. There can be a lot of demonizing that goes along with that. So I kind of love the discussion of humanizing the people that may have to make the really difficult decision of surrendering an animal over to the shelter. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. I think that ultimately, the other thing I forgot to mention is just like veterinary concerns. The dog or cat could have health issues that need to be treated, and an owner may have problems like getting access to that veterinary care, or they may get access, but then it just might be way beyond their means. And I think the more that we can sort of appreciate the parallels to why people may give up their pets and just challenges that we as people face about housing and healthcare and finances, I think that'll help us find solutions for people. And then ultimately, if we can find solutions for people, then we get to help the pets. So I love that.
Yeah. And then looking at, so we've talked about how to keep the pets from getting into the shelter environment, but I know you've also looked into what helps those pets to then be more adoptable out of that shelter environment. What are some of your most interesting findings in that area?
Sure. Probably some of my first work, so before I got into studying fostering, I looked at, like I said, sort of alluded to before, about kind of negative breed stereotypes of certain types of dogs, particularly pit bull type dogs. And so kind of looking at what we can do to really address those real effects. In one of the first studies I had published, one of the studies in that paper took a look at dogs that had been labeled a pit bull type dog or some sort of pit bull type breed, and then a dog that looked very similar. We called them lookalikes, and they were labeled some other breed. And we found that in photographs, when we presented these to folks without labels, that they viewed them similarly in their attractiveness, which was like this sort of amalgamation of questions about trainability and friendliness and aggressivity. And so they were perceived virtually the same. But then when we looked at their stays in the shelter, they were 3 times longer. So I think we can see that impact, and in that paper, we worked with a shelter in Orange County, Florida, when they removed breed labels. And so we looked at what happens, what was going on the year before when they had breed labels in place, and then what happened when they got rid of them. And we found that, yes, for pit bull type dogs, the likelihood of a live outcome increased quite dramatically, even above like terriers, which was the group that they were a part of. But outcomes improved for all dogs. And I think that is sort of sometimes a little bit of a takeaway that gets missed there. But I think if we, are thinking about dogs in shelters, they are often not purebreds. In fact, in another study that we did after that one, we found that most dogs were like 3-4 breeds. And so kind of limiting them to just one breed sort of does a disservice to just how interesting shelter dogs are. And, they are, they have this really interesting genetic breed heritage. And I think if we kind of get out of the way, because we're not really great at visual breed identification with these mixed breed dogs. And so if we just kind of get out of the way, I think that lets the dogs be kind of whoever they might be to that person that's interested in adopting. So I guess it's sort of a what not to do. How about not breed label?
Yeah, that's so interesting.
And so in some more recent work we have been doing on fostering, we initially started looking at fostering as this intervention that was about addressing the immediate welfare of the dogs in the shelter. And I think that is sort of like this interesting component that maybe zoos or even folks that are working with livestock may not necessarily have to deal with. That we are thinking about, what are you experiencing right now? And then we have to get you adopted. So what contributes to you leaving the shelter? And I think that those are two different types of welfare, and it's interesting to take a look at them. So initially we were looking at what are you experiencing, and we found that leaving the shelter improved their outcomes. Leave the shelter overnight in a home. But then we did a study on field trips or brief outings where dogs get to leave the shelter for a couple of hours. And we found that actually it increased their cortisol, activity was increased, and so it didn't kind of have those same sort of rest and recharge benefits that our temporary fostering had. And so not only was that, I think, as a researcher, this sort of like, whoa, that didn't work out as we thought. Oh, wait, but that sort of makes sense. Well, could there be these other effects? I feel like this, the sort of phases you go through when things don't turn out the way you expect. And in that paper, we had left the door open that we were like, well, is there some effect on their adoption likelihood? So in a follow-up paper, we ended up helping about 60 shelters launch field trip and sleepover programs. And what we found is that if a dog goes on a field trip, they are 5 times more likely to be adopted than a dog that doesn't get a field trip. And if they go out of the shelter for, say, 1 to 3 nights, their likelihood of being adopted is 14 times more than a dog that doesn't get to go on a sleepover. So I think between breed labeling and brief and temporary fostering, I think that we can find some real ways to help dogs have a greater likelihood of being adopted.
Yeah, so I'm curious, as a person who might be fostering, are there specific things that a foster can do to further set that animal up for success when they're eventually adopted? Or is it really just that just being away from the shelter for that extended amount of time, that's what does the wonders? Or are there specific things that really make the difference in the home that they're being fostered in?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if we know so much about that from the research lens as like a practitioner. I think one of the things that is wonderful about fostering is that it is an environment that is more similar than the shelter in regards to what their home is likely going to be like. And so I think any time that we can kind of get closer to what they actually might be experiencing in an adoptive home, I think I would wager a guess that our predictive abilities to kind of think about how they might behave in that setting increase. And so I think if that's and sort of through research, some work that was done by the ASPCA took a look. This is about 10 years ago, about their adoption ambassador program, and that was essentially fostering. So dogs would go out into the community, but their foster caregivers help the dogs find a home, an adoptive home. And what they found in that study is that folks that were adopting more often use the information that they got from foster caregivers about the dogs and their decision making than they were in using the information provided by staff at the animal shelter. And And that doesn't mean that the animal shelter staff aren't helpful, but if we kind of think about it from our perspective, we're like, oh, well, you live in a house with this dog. What is this dog like? And that information is probably pretty helpful when you're thinking, oh, okay, like my house is like this, or my house is different. What might I do to make sure that this dog can be successful? So I think that that's sort of an interesting thing to think about when we think about how do we help figure out if a dog is going to be a good fit for a home. I think trial adoption programs are sort of a great way to go about it, because the dogs don't know. Folks will say to me, well, but if you do these like temporary fostering programs or trial adoption programs, what if they think they're being adopted and then they're not? And it's like, but the dogs don't know, right? The dogs are just going into a house, getting a good night's sleep, which they are likely probably not able to do in the shelter. But we find that trial adoption programs are really successful. In some work we did, research we did during the pandemic, about 3/4 of dogs were adopted that went out in trial adoption programs. And I think for me, who I am a bit commitment phobic, that this idea of being able to test drive and make sure the dog's actually a good fit, whether that's through fostering, whether that's through trial adoption programs, I think is something that can help people make a better informed decision. And it's using not just the way the dog looks or how they are in a 5 to 10 minute meeting, but really kind of seeing them in your home and making sure that it is a good match and you can support that dog for the foreseeable future.
So interesting. I wonder if you are an adopter or you're looking to adopt and you don't necessarily have the option to do a trial adoption, what would be some other things that you would recommend that people look into if they are potentially adopting straight from a shelter setting or even from some of these different foster environments?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think information is key in trying to kind of learn more about how the dog behaves. In the shelter, I think that's something that as an industry, I think we're working on, which is just trying to capture more information about the dog. So I think, we talk about there being like lots of data points, right? We're taking all these snapshots of the dog in all these different environments to try to understand how do you typically respond, or to try to get a better understanding of their patterns of behavior. I think that probably can go a long way. I think it's challenging when you're left with just, and that's the interesting thing, is that when we look at the data, when people are walking through the animal shelter, they may be spending maybe just 2 to 3 minutes, as little as like just 10 seconds looking in the kennel at the dog, and then so there's that sort of decision making that's around how they're behaving in the kennel, which we can probably all agree looks play a large role in whether or not you pull the dog out of the kennel to meet them in a meet and greet. But then once they're in the meet and greet, we found that and this is work by Sasha Probopova, that it's like kind of the social behaviors that the dog engages in with people during that meet and greet, like laying down by the person or not refusing a play invitation. If you're a dog meeting somebody and you want to go home, if they throw that tennis ball, just go after it. Even if you don't like the tennis ball, just do it. But so I think that there's like different decision making sort of algorithms that are happening for people, whether it's like, hey, I want to meet you, and hey, I want to take you home, are kind of two different things. And then I think, again, fostering, I think, really helps people make good decisions about how a pet can fit into their lives. So if the animal shelter is sending dogs out into foster care, that can really gather good information. And if the dog is an owner, surrender. I mean, I think that we can, really look back on that information. Did the dog live with kids? Did the dog live with other dogs? If you have cats in your home, did the dog live with cats? I think, successes in those areas can be helpful predictors about whether or not they may do well in your home. It doesn't mean it's, oh, you did great with kids in this environment, you'll do great with kids in this other environment, but at least it's something to build off of when you're thinking about making a big decision like this.
Yeah, and so when we're talking, it's circling back to that idea of how do we keep animals out of the shelter to begin with? And I love that thought process of making sure that we find good matches, right? Because, a lot of people, there's different trends come and goes,
Right.
so, 1 year Huskies are really popular. The next year French Bulldogs are really popular. And then it'll, continue on a cycle forever of there might be different looks and different aesthetics that people gravitate towards.
Sure.
But that's not all that goes into finding a good match for your home. Like if you're a person that's like a really active person that loves to hike, maybe you don't want to adopt a couch potato. Same way, like if you yourself are more of a calm, chill person that likes to stay at home, you may want to find an animal that also likes to stay at home with you. And so I love that idea of, okay, so when we're adopting out these dogs, let's make sure that there's a lot of good information that people can make good decisions on, so there isn't that return to a shelter after they're adopted. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just absolutely agree with you, and I think a lot of this is about thinking about the individual dog, because dog breeds, they do matter. Now, how they come together in a mixed breed dog is unknown, but I think that we can all agree that dogs aren't like the same dog, just in different costumes, right? Like they even, these differences they have morphologically may be related to differences in behavior, or they may just have different looks and different behavior. And so we need to really take a look at the individual in front of us and, what are their likes, what are their dislikes, what are their preferences, so that we can so we can help people find a good fit. I think it's challenging when we kind of see it from the perspective of the potential adopter walking into the shelter. They're only making as good a decisions as information we're providing. So if we're unhappy that they're basing their decisions on the way that the dogs look, perhaps we give them perhaps we give them different information and see if that can help inform their decision making beyond just the looks of the dog. Of course, looks matter, right? I'm not going to say that they don't, because they absolutely do. But there's the looks plus their behavior that I think once you live with the dog, they can be as good looking as all get out. But if they're naughty in a way that doesn't fit your life, then I don't think that that's going to go too far.
And so do you see that as kind of the future of animal sheltering, of really looking more at the individual animals, maybe looking less at breeds, and more at just kind of getting them into the right home, the right fit for that animal, versus kind of, I don't know, I guess individually identifying what animals are and kind of allowing them to spend more time in the shelter environment?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think if they are in the shelter, yes, I think this is what we know works, like on an evidence-based approach about supporting their well-being while they're there, and collecting lots of information about them so that we can support potential adopters in making like informed decisions. So I think that's really important. But honestly, I kind of see the future of sheltering as much as it is about that. It is also about making sure they never come into the shelter. And some of that is like about the work that we were talking about. And in some research that we did at the end of my postdoc with Maddie's fund, we took a look at safety net fostering. So that's the fostering of owned pets when owners are experiencing a temporary hardship. So maybe they are being hospitalized, or they're receiving some sort of treatment, or they're moving house, all these things in which they temporarily can't take care of their pet, but they care about their pet deeply, and they just need a bit of time, a little grace to be able to, get a little extra support, and then they can take back their pet. And so in that work, we helped almost 20 shelters develop these programs, and we had almost 500 pets in our data set, dogs, cats. I think there were turtles and fish, and we had lots of different types of animals. But what we found is that in almost 80% of cases, owners took their pet back. They were able to resolve that hardship they were experiencing, and and bring their pet back into their lives. And I think that is just pretty amazing when we think about it, that, if we can really help support people, whether that's like sort of emotionally with programs, but also financially, that it doesn't cost, it costs money to keep animals in shelters. And if we can use our foster networks that we've developed for shelter pets and expand them to include owned pets, and we find that people are kind of inspired to help pets that are owned in a way that's a little different than shelter animals. So I think that we can actually expand our foster networks to help both shelter pets and owned pets, but we can keep them out of the shelter altogether. That it's not only just like a resources issue, but it's also a well-being issue, that if they can avoid the shelter and stay with somebody in their home, and these programs don't take long to be successful, that most folks, even though they could have been enrolled in the program for 90 days, even in some cases 120, the average amount of time folks needed was just a couple months. And so I think that is really important to consider when we think about the pets that are coming into shelters, and can we just help the folks that care about them to keep them. I think that would go a long way to preserving the human-animal bond, which is, I think, important work.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And it almost sounds like the future of sheltering is really moving it to where it's more disseminated amongst community. Like, instead of having a centralized shelter where it's kind of detached from any sense of being a part of a society, of a community, of a neighborhood, it becomes more about caring for each other. Just like we would care for our neighbors, these dogs are a part of our community, and it's something that everyone can contribute to.
Absolutely. Yes, you nailed it. Yeah, I think I would love to see a time where the animal shelter, the shelter continues to be integrated into the community, where, yes, it might be a hub where some dogs are waiting there. Maybe they're incredibly adoptable. They're going to fly out the door, and so hanging out for a couple days in the shelter may not be that big of a deal for them, but maybe it could be. But we use that sort of hub as a way that the community can connect with us. And I think the more that we can make the animal shelter more approachable, whether that means the owners coming to the shelter for help, like a temporary fostering like a safety net fostering program, or training classes. I think that, or I would love for more shelters to have cat cafes. I mean, like, come on, why not do it at the shelter? You've already got the cats, and everyone loves coffee, or just about everyone does, or tea, or some warm beverage. That I think that could be a way to just make a lot of this like more accessible to helping, and also to reaching out when you need help.
Yeah, it's like making the shelter not just a resource for animals, but a resource for people. Like, so many, a lot of, we live in a city that has a very large and really great municipal shelter, and they have so many resources for our community. Like, I've brought pets there just to get a microchip, just to get a vaccine, where it's affordable. And they have a lot of programs that connect people to the shelter, where our city's municipal shelter, it's like a common household name. Everyone knows about it, and everyone connects with it in different ways.
Your research has dived into so many different aspects of this shelter stay and taking care of these animals and keeping them out of shelters. And you really have applied all of these amazing skills that you've learned throughout your education. And so what advice would you have for somebody who is looking to get into the field of applied animal behavior, or trying to pursue that as a degree option?
Oh, that's great. I think that one of the sort of aspects of my career that I think has helped support me in the research that I do now, the teaching, extension, is really just that practical experience with the animals, and spending a decade in sheltering and training with owners, and and their pets. I think that was really informative because I think as a scientist, it really helps you understand your system and understand how it works. And I think especially if you're interested in behavior, I think there's just such a huge aspect of observation and just watching the animals and like, why do they do what they do? And just being really curious about that. So I think if you can volunteer with whatever type of animal, if it's a dog or cat, certainly at your local animal shelter. But I think there's a lot of ways that you can get involved with animals before you even decide, hey, I want to make a career out of this. Because I think it's whatever you decide. I think it's it's a commitment to a career. It doesn't mean that you have to keep on doing that. Present person included. You don't have to stick with it. But I think that it can be daunting to try to figure out what you want to do. And so I think again, I'm all about information. So making sure you have those experiences that you're like, yeah, I really want to work in this environment. I think more and more we're seeing universities across the country offering more coursework around, in my particular interest in companion animal behavior. I think that is happening more and more. We're developing courses here at Virginia Tech that are specifically called shelter dog training, and we're developing courses with dogs, with cats. And our students are going to the local animal shelter and implementing enrichment programs and training classes. So I think really checking out like your university options, and if this is something that you're interested in, it's very well possible that your local university or hopefully a university near to you is providing that type of coursework. And then I think that it's not just at the undergraduate level. I think that even if you get your bachelor's degree and decide you want to come back and have some sort of post-grad education, there's plenty of master's programs now across the country. Many of them are online that you can, kind of formalize maybe the education you've received through dog training academies or just animal behavior courses to really kind of put it all together. So I think there's a lot of different ways that if you want this type of career, there's the practical that, I think is very important, but then there's the sort of academic or foundational knowledge work that I think together can really prepare you for a career in this field.
Yeah, that's great advice of if you're interested in something, just get your boots on the ground and go experience it and see how you like it and see what you learn. Because I know for myself, I started by just going to the zoo and doing a lot of animal observations during an unpaid internship that I had, where I would just sit in front of a habitat and watch the animal for hours and hours. And that's when I realized that it's something that I was interested in. So you can learn so much by just like going out there, going to the shelter, going to another animal facility, working at a barn or anything. Just get out there and see how you like it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love that you did that as well. I think that when you can just look at your own behavior and you're like, do I want to be there more? Do I want to spend more time there? Do I want to sit in front of that closure and just watch them? Do I want to do another dog training class where I'm helping out the people and the pets or the dogs in the shelter? I think we can just look at our own behavior to see where like our activity budgets are, right? Where are we approaching our time? Because that's a good indicator of what we care about.
Yeah, absolutely. So now today, is there something that you're curious about right now? Doesn't have to be animal related at all, but is there something that's piquing your curiosity after all these years of work?
Oh. Wow. Okay. I'm still absolutely fascinated by the animal shelter. I feel like I'm probably never going to get tired of it. I just feel like deeply driven to try to help the animals that are there and try to understand their experience. So I think a lot of my work, my research now is really about like just answering that question, what are you experiencing? And, trying to understand that through novel assessments, bringing in, paradigms from other literature with other animals, just to try to answer that question. So there's all that part. And then I think just helping, just trying to learn more. So I'm just curious about what works in this environment to help people and help the pets. So I think that's probably going to keep me busy for a few lifetimes, is my guess.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I feel like my brain has been expanded even more about animal sheltering. It's definitely something that you could just, it's one of those things that you take for granted. That's just something that's always just there.
Yeah.
But there's really so much that you can dive into. So thank you so much for being here. Is there anything exciting happening in your life that you want to share with our audience?
Yeah, sure. So we have an upcoming conference, the Canine Science Symposium. It's in May in San Francisco, and it's 2 days of applied canine science. So we have about 14 talks over the 2 days. Talk about, I think your brain just like sort of, gets bigger and bigger with every talk, and it's kind of hard to keep it all in. But we have 2 days of talks. We even have an emerging scientist session. So for grad students, postdocs, they can submit their abstracts for a poster. And I love that part of it because I love connecting practitioners that are just like really curious about why, like interventions to try to help dogs, and then new scientists that are, have research that they want to share. So the conference is actually mainly practitioner sort of focused. That's why we're always talking about applied science and those types of research questions. But we have both practitioners, scientists, because there's just not enough canine science conferences. So so it's 2 days in San Francisco, and you can attend in person or online. And our website is caninesciencesymposium.com. And and we have discounted tickets until the end of March.
Thank you. And if you listening, if you want to learn more about that, we'll have links to the website in our description. And then also, if there's anything that you're curious about that you'd like to hear more about on the podcast, just write us an email. All the information's in the description.